In the autumn of 1886, in the vast and unforgiving expanse of the Wyoming Territory, Elspeth MacLeod became a peculiar spectacle. The other homesteaders, settled into their hard-won soddies and rough-hewn cabins on the open prairie, would stop their work to watch her. They saw a woman alone, save for her two small children, engaged in an act that defied all sense and convention. Instead of reinforcing the walls of the small cabin her late husband had built, she was systematically dismantling it, hauling the precious timber not to a new site on the plains, but to a jagged slash of rock 2 miles distant. It was a long, dark fissure in a limestone outcropping that rose from the land like a broken bone, a place the local Arapaho were said to avoid and which the settlers regarded as little more than a geological curiosity. A place for snakes in the summer and deep, wind-scoured snowdrifts in the winter. To see her lowering her worldly goods, her children, and herself into this stony maw was, to the practical mind of the frontier, an act of profound and pitiable madness. Amos Kelleher was the first to approach her, his boots crunching on the scree at the base of the rock formation. He was a man whose certainty was as flat and unyielding as the plains he farmed, a man who understood the known geometries of survival. For walls, a solid roof, and a well-chinked stovepipe. He watched as Elspeth, using a simple rope and pulley system rigged to a dead juniper, carefully lowered a wooden crate into the 30-foot-deep crack. His wife, Dora, stood a ways back, her arms crossed over her chest in a posture of communal worry that was indistinguishable from judgment. Amos cleared his throat, a sound that seemed small and dry against the immense silence of the land. "Elspeth," he began, his voice straining to be gentle. "A body needs to know what you're about here. This ain't no place to winter. It's a tomb you're building." He meant the word kindly, as a warning, but it hung in the air with the weight of prophecy. Elspeth paused her work, pulling a stray strand of auburn hair from her face with a dusty hand. She looked at Amos, her eyes the color of the gray sky that promised an early and brutal winter. She did not seem mad. Her gaze was steady, her movements deliberate. "It is a shelter, Amos," she said, her voice retaining a trace of the Scottish Highlands, a soft burr that seemed alien in this sharp-edged land. "It is warmer than any house you could build." Amos shook his head, a slow, sad gesture of disagreement. "Warmer? It's rock. It'll leach the heat from your bones. There's no sun, no air. How will you vent a stove? The smoke will kill you before the cold does. You'll be buried in the first drift and no one will find you till the thaw." Dora Kelleher nodded from her safe distance, her expression confirming that this was the consensus of all sensible people. They saw a grieving widow, her mind unsettled by loss, retreating into the earth itself. It was a tragedy unfolding in slow, laborious motion, and amusement at the strangeness of it was a safer position to hold than naked pity. Elspeth did not argue, for she knew that explaining the principle was a different thing entirely from stating the fact. Watching an outcome is not the same as understanding the reason. She had tried once, weeks earlier, to explain it to Constance Hartwell, a quieter neighbor who watched with more curiosity than condemnation. She had spoken of the earth's deep, constant heart, a warmth that resided below the frost line, a stable temperature that neither the searing sun of summer nor the howling blizzards of winter could touch. She had tried to describe the concept of thermal mass, how the immense body of rock would soak up the heat from a small, controlled fire and radiate it back steadily, creating a gentle and persistent warmth that a drafty cabin, with its constant battle between a roaring stove and the encroaching cold, could never achieve. Constance had listened, her brow furrowed, but in the end, she had simply patted Elspeth's arm and said, "You take care." Now the principle remained an abstraction, a piece of strange philosophy against the hard, physical reality of a Wyoming winter. The knowledge had not been her own, not originally. It was a legacy from her husband, Ewan, a man who had seen the world not as a surface to be tamed, but as a system of immense and elegant forces. He had been a geologist in Scotland, a man more comfortable with strata and pressure than with ledgers and commerce. He had filled dozens of journals with sketches, observations, and calculations. Before he had succumbed to the fever that spring, he had spent months walking this very land, not with the eyes of a farmer looking for arable soil, but with the eyes of an engineer searching for structure. He had mapped this fissure, noted its depth, its orientation away from the prevailing winter wind, and the smaller secondary crack that ran parallel to it a few feet away. In his last weeks, when the fever gave him moments of lucidity, he had sketched the design for her on a piece of scrap paper. "The earth provides, Elspeth," he had whispered, his voice thin as parchment. "It holds a steady heat. You just have to get into its embrace out of the wind. The stone will be your blanket." She now clung to his words and his calculations not as a grieving widow clings to a memory, but as a master craftsman clings to a proven blueprint. Her work was slow and punishingly methodical. The first task had been to clean the fissure. For 2 weeks, she descended on a rope ladder, painstakingly prying loose stones from the walls, sending them clattering to the bottom. She shoveled out centuries of accumulated dirt, debris, and the bones of small animals, hoisting the refuse up in buckets. The children, 8-year-old Jamie and 6-year-old Isla, played at the top, their voices echoing strangely in the narrow space, a constant reminder of what she was working for. She was not just building a shelter. She was carving a sanctuary out of the skeleton of the world. She needed a space that would not just keep them alive, but would allow them to live, to have room for a small table, for their beds, for the quiet rhythms of a life lived indoors through a long, dark season. About 12 feet down, the fissure widened slightly, creating a natural ledge. This became the foundation for their living space. Using the salvaged timber from the old cabin, she painstakingly constructed a floor, wedging the main support beams into crevices in the rock and securing them with iron pins Ewan had intended for a barn that would never be built. The floor was rough but solid, a platform of civilization suspended in a raw, geological space. Below this floor, the fissure continued down another 18 feet, a deep, cold cellar that would act as a sump for any dampness and a reservoir of stable, 50-degree air that would constantly, gently rise. This deep space was Ewan's masterstroke, the engine of the entire system, a simple fact of physics that Amos Kelleher, with his focus on surface construction, could never have conceived. The entrance was the most critical piece of engineering. A simple hatch would be buried by snow and leak precious heat. Elspeth constructed a small, heavily framed structure over the top of the fissure, like a low, solid dormer window emerging from the rock. It was built of the thickest timbers from the cabin and packed with a foot of dense sod. The door itself was a masterpiece of insulation, a thick wooden slab sheathed in cured rabbit pelts and designed to fit so snugly into its frame that not a whisper of wind could penetrate it. From the inside, it was secured with a heavy wooden bar. It was less a door and more a plug, sealing them into the earth. This structure was her only vulnerability to the world above, the single point of entry and exit, the place where the howling fury of a blizzard would meet the quiet stillness of the rock. The problem of ventilation, which Amos had so confidently identified as a fatal flaw, was the element that contained the quiet genius of Ewan's design. He had noted the smaller, secondary fissure, no wider than a man's arm, that ran alongside the main opening. Elspeth spent a week carefully widening its base with a hammer and chisel, creating a small, stone-lined hearth at the far end of her wooden floor. She then worked her way up the narrow crack, clearing obstructions until it had a clear, unimpeded path to the surface, where it exited 20 feet away from the main entrance. This was her chimney. It would operate on the simple principle of convection. A small, hot fire in the hearth would heat the air in the narrow flue, causing it to rise and draw smoke with it. This rising air would, in turn, pull fresh, clean air down the main fissure, through the living space, and across the floor to the fire pit, creating a constant, gentle circulation. It was a breathing system, powered by a tiny flame, designed to mimic the elegant efficiency of a living lung. By late October, as the first hard frosts began to silver the prairie grasses each morning, the work was done. From the outside, there was little to see but the low, sod-covered hump of the entryway nestled against the rock, looking more like a badger's set than a human habitation. The Kellehers and the other neighbors had long since stopped offering advice, their interactions with Elspeth now tinged with a solemnity reserved for the terminally ill. They offered to take her children, to give her a corner in their own cabins, gestures she politely but firmly refused. Their pity was a heavier burden than the stones she had hauled. She moved her family and their few possessions into the earth. The last thing she lowered was Ewan's box of journals, the source of her faith. As she sealed the heavy door for the first time, plunging their new home into a cool, fireless twilight, the silence was absolute. It was the deep, ancient quiet of the stone, a silence that had reigned in this fissure for millennia, and it was now their own. The first weeks were an adjustment. The only natural light came from the top of the fissure, a soft, indirect glow that fell upon the wooden floor. She kept a lantern burning for most of their waking hours, its gentle hiss a comforting counterpoint to the profound silence. The air was cool but never cold, and it held the clean, dry scent of dust and minerals. The children, after a brief period of uncertainty, came to see it as a great adventure, a secret castle hidden from the world. Jamie would lower a bucket on a string into the darkness below their floor, pretending to fish in subterranean lakes, while Isla drew pictures on a slate of the strange, swirling patterns in the rock walls. Elspeth cooked on the small hearth, and they watched in fascination as the smoke was obediently drawn away up the narrow flue, leaving the air in their chamber clean and breathable. She was proving the principle to herself day by day in 100 small domestic ways. The true test began in the second week of November. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hard blue for days, began to soften, its color leaching away until it was the color of whey. A profound stillness fell over the prairie, an absence of wind that was more menacing than any gale. Elspeth, standing at the entrance of her shelter, felt the change in the pressure of the air, a heavy, watchful quality. She knew the signs. She had seen winters like this gathering in the highlands, winters that could erase the familiar landscape and rewrite the rules of survival. She herded the children inside, secured the final stores of wood she had stacked near the hearth, and set the heavy bar across the door. Outside, the first snowflake, a perfect, intricate star, landed on the sod roof of her entryway. It was followed by another, and then 1,000, and then 1,000,000, until the air itself seemed to be turning to a solid, swirling mass of white. For the first day, the only evidence of the storm was the gradual darkening of the light from above. The soft gray glow at the top of the fissure faded to a dim twilight, and then to a near-complete blackness as the snow piled up over her entrance. The world outside had been erased, but the sound was the most astonishing thing. Instead of the terrifying shriek of the wind she remembered from the cabin, the sound that had always felt like a predator trying to claw its way in. Here there was only a deep, muffled roar, a distant, cosmic hum. It was the sound of a battle being fought far away, a battle from which they were completely shielded. The rock absorbed the vibrations, the earth deadened the sound, and their little pocket of existence was left in a state of profound and unshakable peace. She tended her system with the precise, unhurried movements of a priestess at an altar. The fire was the heart of their survival, but she knew that a large, greedy fire was the enemy. It would consume their precious fuel too quickly and overwhelm the delicate balance of the ventilation shaft. Instead, she kept a small, concentrated fire of dry cottonwood, no larger than a loaf of bread. It produced a surprising amount of heat, which was immediately absorbed by the stone hearth and the rock walls around it. The principle of thermal mass was now at work. The stone acted as a battery, storing the heat and releasing it slowly and evenly throughout their living space. The temperature in the chamber never rose to a stuffy heat, nor did it ever fall to a chill. It remained in a state of constant, comfortable coolness, a climate of pure stability while the world above was being torn apart by extremes. Days passed. Elspeth lost track of time, measuring their existence only in the rhythms of meals, sleep, and the feeding of the fire. She read to the children from their only book, a collection of Scottish folk tales, her voice calm and steady in the lantern light. They played games, told stories, and lived in a bubble of serene isolation. There were moments, in the deep quiet of their artificial night, when a flicker of doubt would touch her. What if Amos had been right? What if the snow was so deep it would never melt? What if the flue had become blocked? But then she would place her hand against the rock wall, and she would feel it. It was not the biting, inert cold of a dead stone. It was cool, yes, but it was a living coolness, radiating a faint and almost imperceptible energy. It was the steady, rhythmic pulse of the earth's own warmth, the very principle upon which Yuan had staked their lives. It was the feeling of faith made manifest, and it calmed her fears. On what she guessed was the fourth or fifth day, the deep roaring from above began to subside. The cosmic hum lessened, fading hour by hour until it was replaced by the familiar, profound silence of the stone. The storm had passed. A sliver of light, pale and blue, began to appear at the top of the fissure, a sign that the sky was clearing. It was time. She roused the children, who had been sleeping soundly, their breath misting slightly in the cool air. With a deep breath, she lifted the heavy bar from the door and pushed. First, it wouldn't budge. A knot of cold fear tightened in her stomach. Had they been entombed? She put her shoulder into it, pushing with all her strength. There was a scraping sound, a heavy groan, and then the door gave way, swinging open into a world of impossible, blinding whiteness. The snow was piled higher than the entrance, and she had to tunnel upward through 4 feet of dense, compacted drift to break the surface. When she finally emerged, blinking against the fierce glare, the sight that greeted her was one of awe and devastation. The world had been remade. The prairie was gone, buried beneath a seamless ocean of snow, its familiar contours softened into gentle, rolling dunes. The sky was a painfully deep, cloudless blue. The air was so cold and still it felt like a solid thing, a pane of glass that might shatter. It stung her lungs, a shocking, crystalline cold that was utterly alien to the gentle air she had been breathing for days. In the distance, she could see the other homesteads, or rather, the places where they were supposed to be. Only the very tops of their roofs were visible, dark rectangles in the white expanse, with thin plumes of smoke rising hesitantly from their stovepipes. They looked fragile, exposed, and half-drowned. She stood there for a long moment, a lone figure in a vast, silent landscape. The sensory proof of her success was overwhelming. It was in the shocking contrast between the air on her face and the air at her back, which flowed gently up from the fissure. It was in the quiet, triumphant hum of the rock, which had held them safe and steady through the maelstrom. She looked at the small, snow-covered mound of her chimney, 20 feet away, a faint wisp of heat shimmering above it, and she understood the completeness of her victory. It was not a victory against the winter, for that was a battle that could never be won. It was a victory of understanding, of listening to the quiet wisdom of the earth instead of shouting at it with hammers and saws. She thought of Yuan, and a single tear froze on her cheek. He had seen this in his mind's eye with perfect clarity. He had given her the map and she had followed it home. It was 2 more days before she saw another soul. A figure appeared on the horizon, moving slowly and painfully through the massive drifts. It was Amos Kelleher. He was making his way toward her outcropping, checking on the neighbors he could reach. As he drew closer, she could see the exhaustion etched on his face. His beard was rimed with ice, and his skin was raw and chapped from the wind. He moved with the stiff, weary gait of a man who had not been properly warm for a week. He was expecting to find a tragedy, to begin the grim work of digging for the widow MacLeod and her children. When he saw her standing by the entrance, hale and calm, with Jamie and Isla playing beside her, sculpting the snow into strange creatures, he stopped dead. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "Amos," Elspeth said, her voice carrying easily in the still air. "You look frozen through. Come down and get warm." He stared at her, then at the dark opening at her feet, as if he could not reconcile the two. He stumbled forward, his skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes. He peered down into the fissure, and the first thing that struck him was the air that rose to meet him. It was not the damp, frigid air of a cave. It was cool, certainly, but it was a living air, and it carried the faint, impossible scent of wood smoke and cooked bacon. He descended the ladder cautiously, his heavy boots finding the rungs. When he stepped onto the wooden floor, he stopped again, looking around the chamber in stunned silence. He saw the small, efficient fire, the neatly stacked beds, the lantern casting a warm glow on the rock walls. He held out his bare hands, and instead of a biting cold, he felt a gentle, pervasive warmth radiating from the stone around him. He turned to Elspeth, his expression stripped of all its former certainty. He was a man confronting the complete collapse of his known world. He had spent the last 5 days and nights in his own cabin, a structure he had built with pride and skill. He had burned through half his winter supply of wood just to keep the inside temperature above freezing. He and Dora had huddled in blankets, listening to the wind tear at the shingles and the frost creep across the floor. He had fought the winter, and it had nearly broken him. Elspeth had simply stepped out of its way. "How?" he asked, the word a mere whisper. "The stone," she said simply. "It holds the heat from the earth. You only need a small fire to keep it steady." He reached out and placed a hand on the wall, just as she had done. He felt the faint, persistent energy within it. He was a practical man, and this was the most practical thing he had ever encountered. He looked from the wall to her face, and in his eyes, she saw the dawn of a new and profound understanding. "I'll be damned, Elspeth," he said, his voice full of a quiet awe he had never before expressed. "You were right. The Great Blizzard of '86, as it came to be known, was a crucible that reshaped the community. Several families lost most of their livestock, and one homesteader, a bachelor who lived on the far side of the creek, was found frozen in his cabin. In the aftermath, as the survivors dug themselves out, the story of what Elspeth MacLeod had done spread from cabin to cabin. It was no longer a tale of a poor widow's madness, but a legend of impossible survival. Amos Kelleher became her unlikely apostle. He brought others to see the fissure dwelling, explaining the principles of its operation with the zeal of a new convert. He spoke of thermal mass and ventilation not as strange theories, but as practical tools like an axe or a plow. He pointed out how Elspeth had used a tiny fraction of the firewood he had, yet had lived in greater comfort and safety. Elspeth shared her knowledge freely. She showed them Ewan's journals, with their precise drawings and temperature calculations. She explained that the key was not just to go underground, but to understand the system. The deep sump for stable air, the insulated entrance to defeat the wind, and the double fissure design for safe, constant ventilation. She taught them to look at the land differently, to see the ravines, the rock outcroppings, and the deep-cut creek beds not as obstacles, but as opportunities. That spring, 2 families began digging new homes into the side of a steep, south-facing hill, creating earth-sheltered dugouts that applied the same principles. Amos himself, with Elspeth's guidance, constructed a deep, stone-lined root cellar that used a ventilation shaft modeled on hers, and for the first time, his potatoes and apples lasted through the winter without freezing or rotting. The fissure dwelling became a permanent feature of the landscape, a testament to a quiet revolution. Elspeth and her children lived there for 5 more winters, each one easier than the last. She eventually expanded it, carving out a second room from a softer seam in the rock and improving the interior with plastered walls and better furniture. Jamie and Isla grew up with the steady pulse of the earth as a constant presence in their lives, a rhythm of safety and stability that shaped them in profound ways. When Elspeth finally did build a small house on the surface, it was for the summers, a place to embrace the sun and the open air. But the fissure remained their winter home, their fortress against the cold. The innovation, born of one man's vision and one woman's tireless labor, became woven into the fabric of the community's wisdom, a hard-won lesson in the art of yielding to the great and benevolent power of the earth. The home that had once been dismissed as a tomb had become the cradle of a new kind of survival, its warmth passed down through generations.